Hey, everybody, time for episode number 3. Change begins with you. So, do you ever feel like if your partner would just stop doing this, things would be so much better? I hear this all the time and may or may not have felt it myself. I'll be honest. More on that later. The reality is to make healthy changes in a relationship, we have to first look at ourselves and start there. So, let me give you guys kind of a personal example here. So, I've told you that kind of the later part of our engagement and the beginning of our marriage was probably more the rough patch that Jake and I have had in our relationship. So, we got into marriage counseling pretty quickly, more just kind of proactively, that kind of thing. And I do have to give a shout out. It was totally Jake's idea to do that, so which is awesome. And so we got into counseling with a Gottman therapist, of course. That's kind of what I was looking for, and he was open to that too. So I remember in the first session, I was we were both just kind of upset and, kind of just what do we need to do kind of thing. And I remember our therapist asked us something to the effect of, what will things look like when things are better in your relationship? And I responded first. And I know that my response was something to the effect of, well, when things are better in our relationship, he will do X, Y, and Z. And she kind of stopped me. She totally interrupted me, and which is not a bad thing if your therapist does that. And she said, "No, what will things look like for you? What will you look like when things have changed, when things are better?" So even though I wasn't totally feeling it in the moment, it totally forced me to really look at, okay, what are the changes ultimately I need to make in order to get there? And it did not put the responsibility on Jake to make those changes in order for things to look better between the two of us. And so that was kind of the start of it. And eventually I kind of learned how to let go of that. And once I was able to do that and really start working on myself, and he was working on himself, and things ultimately got way better within a few months. And seriously, we reflect on that time now a few years later and are just like, man, things feel so opposite. It's so great. So I've been there if you guys have ever felt that way. So, where this comes up a lot of times in the sessions with my own clients might be, you know, sometimes wanting to spend an entire session or the majority of the session really talking about the partner, the spouse, or whatever, and what they're doing wrong or what they're doing that's hurtful or whatever. And, um, and so sometimes I will interrupt my clients and just kind of talk to them about, well, how is this affecting you? And if I'm really close with the client in the sense of have really good therapeutic rapport and I know that I can do this without damaging the relationship, I will sometimes pause and ask, I know that this is a really hard question, but I'm just curious. Do you think you might be doing anything unknowingly that's contributing to this dynamic? So that's sometimes how it will come up in our sessions. And so in the sense, I don't really want the entire therapy session to be about venting about the partner. There's definitely a time and a place. I mean, at the end of the day, we all do need some kind of safe space just to kind of like word vomit, basically. But we can't let that be the entire thing that we do. And we also need to do this with safe people in our life. A therapist is a great person to do this because sometimes if we're doing this with a family member or a close friend who knows our partner or knows our spouse, this can really cloud their judgment of that person, and we really don't want to do this. Now, a little caveat here. I actually haven't brought this up yet in the podcast, and so I might bring this up every few sessions or so, but I am absolutely not talking about characterological or pathological issues in relationships. So for me, this would be like domestic violence. This might be something that has been happening even before the relationship, maybe an addiction your partner has. Maybe not so much an addiction, but kind of a long-standing behavior that really gets in the way of healthy communication, healthy intimacy, and all of that. So I do want to give a caveat. I am really not talking about any of those issues throughout this podcast. I'm talking about normal things that come up in most relationships that are fixable to really help us get to a healthy place. Now, a lot of those other things I just mentioned are absolutely fixable, but they are fixable with very professional help and typically over a long period of time. So I do want to kind of share that. So the other piece is, sometimes wanting to come to therapy to like get a diagnosis for their partner. And this is something that, you have to be really careful about as a therapist. And just, I'm very careful to say, well, I'm only hearing one side of the story and, I'm only getting one perspective. I don't know your partner and all that, So at the end of the day, if your own therapist or if you know someone in your life or Dr. Google, you cannot diagnose your partner, okay? And your therapist cannot diagnose your partner unless your therapist happens to know your partner. So that's kind of another thing I see how this comes up in therapy sessions with clients who are really struggling with this idea that change begins with them. And it's easy to fall into that. Change begins with our partner or our spouse. So I think one of the things that we can really work on to do about this is having a lot of self-awareness, but self-awareness without falling apart. And that's kind of a phrase from this particular type of therapy that I do called radically open DBT. And it's basically a way of cultivating openness so that we can hear disconfirming feedback from someone without kind of shutting down, without going into what's called don't hurt me mode or anything like that, without getting defensive. And it doesn't mean that someone who gives us disconfirming feedback is correct. I think that that's part of the openness. Not falling apart is being able to have the openness to hear the disconfirming feedback, to maybe even just mull over, oh, is there a bit of truth to this? Maybe, maybe not. So I'm just really big on self-awareness, and I think we need a little bit of openness in order to even be willing to take a look at ourselves. And I'm somewhat assuming if you're listening to this podcast that you already have some of that openness with yourself, that you are willing to look at these things, which I think is great. Really helps. You are ahead of the game if you're already looking at this in terms of change beginning with you. So, if you feel like you want more action steps associated with this self awareness without falling apart, I highly recommend some kind of journaling practice. This could be like seriously a formal journal. Go to like a bookstore or Amazon and just get like a really fun journal or cute journal, whatever that you want to be able to handwrite something in, and just simply journal about your feelings. Maybe an incident or a conversation happened with you and your partner, and I just encourage you to kind of write out factually what happened and then write out what are your feelings, what are your emotions. Don't write out your assumptions. Just write out for you, what are you experiencing? And you can write out some thoughts, but just make sure they're not assumptions of the other person. They're more thoughts of what I'm finding myself thinking is, or I'm having a thought that, okay, just so we get a little bit of distance from that. Um, with that, you can also think about what does this conversation or what does this feeling, what does this situation remind me of? Was there a past conversation like this, maybe with another person? Have you felt this sense of disappointment or hurt in another circumstance in your life? Just kind of looking at, is there a button or is there a trigger that maybe this just kind of pushed? Along those lines, when has this come up in the past? Again, thinking of other relationships, thinking of a different time, maybe before you even met your spouse or your partner, something like that. Is there some kind of correlation there? And then writing out, what do you need? So it might be, I need a sense of stability. I need a sense of safety. For me, going back to some of those early marriage counseling sessions with my husband and I think what I really needed and what I was searching for that I have now was really kind of this sense of emotional safety and stability in our marriage. And not to say that my husband in any way made me feel unsafe. It wasn't that. It was more so this picture I got. I wanted to not have so much tension or conflict at home. I wanted to be able to come home from work and us go out to like a nice dinner and talk about our days and laugh together and things like that kind of emotional safety where I knew I was coming home to like an easy environment. And a big part of that, and this kind of goes into some of my stuff that was coming into our marriage, was because happened to be that year and this kind of all goes together. My husband had lost his job a few months before we got married. I had expanded my practice, which was really exciting, but I found myself working many more hours and making a lot less money. So I had a lot of business decisions I really had to adjust to. And this is a total side note, but oh my gosh, I totaled my car that year because if you're in Houston, you know how sometimes it is with rain. And side note, this is apart from hurricanes and tropical storms, but there was this one crazy afternoon, really, really heavy rainstorm. And there's this area that my husband, we had gone to lunch together, and there's this area that the water just built up super fast. And I was kind of like, I think I can make it. He's like, I don't know, babe. And I'm like, it's fine. I'm in a really big sedan. It'll be fine. No, and so it ruined the engine and all that, and I was just kicking myself, and also because my husband had cautioned me against driving through that, so that was a huge lesson, and he was so gracious. Never once has he said, "I told you so." He's such a sweet guy. But that had just happened, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is like the worst possible year money-wise for all this we were paying for this wedding," you know? And so just a really stressful time. So it wasn't just, kind of the marriage part, it was all this other stuff. I was coming home with a lot on my mind, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and I kind of just wanted to come home to um, laughter and fun and peace and calm and all of that. And so being able to narrow down, those were my needs. It wasn't that I had a need for my husband to do X, Y, and Z. These were my emotional needs. And within a few months, we totally got there, and it's been so much better. So I want you guys to think about doing that. If you are not super into journaling, no worries at all. You can do this mentally. You can do this maybe verbally, do a voice memo on your phone, or you can even take a note on your phone. It doesn't have to be in like a fancy journal. Password protected if you want to do that, if you have people who have access to your phone or your computer or something like that. But we just kind of want to gain some insight as we start on this journey of change beginning with us. So, hope that is a little seed planted for you guys, gives you something to think about until the next episode. Until then.